Hello everybody, how's it going today? GoldPlasma231 here, back in day to talk about Oshinoko, chapter number 147. This chapter is titled Wish. And just off rip from the beginning, let's just go ahead and get into why this chapter may be the weirdest Oshinoko chapter of all time. And as somebody who reads every Oshinoko chapter, like probably anybody watching this video, I have come to notice the design qualities that go into making a good Oshinoko chapter, right? And while I personally think that that's any chapter that has a Kane in it, which this chapter does, so this chapter is automatically amazing, but another big design quality is the way that we get the title of the chapter, every chapter. And that is normally done through a little just icon on the first page of each chapter that's pretty much a little star, and inside says doesn't say Oshinoko, it just says chapter number blah 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 blah, and then it's titled blah 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 blah, right? And this chapter is, if I'm not mistaken, there may have been Oshinoko chapters in the past where I am just a big moron and dum-dum and have not realized this, but this is the first chapter where I can clearly tell that that isn't the case, because this just says chapter number 147 Wish, all written out in one long line, and yeah, that's it. There is no star icon here, which is just really, really weird to me, at least, because what in the world? That is just so random, so different, and so weird. That is, like, not what I was expecting when it came to this Oshinoko chapter. But, hey, it is what it is, right? The other really interesting thing about this chapter is how it starts off. We start off with a cover page, which is the a colored cover page, which of course is the illustration for volume 15 of the manga. Volume 15, I forget if it has been released yet or if this was just an early reveal for a chapter cover. I honestly do not fully remember, but we will be seeing this volume into print at some point. I do like the volume cover. It shows two different colors on it, which of course is the two different colors of the Oshinoko volume covers. Of course, the white and the black. The black is predominantly on the left side, while the while the white is on the right side of the cover. And we have two characters on the color page this time, being Ruby and I. Of course, I can't tell if this is supposed to portray that Ruby is playing the both of them in this scenario, or if that's like the real I. Who knows in this series about acting where they can make one character look infinitely different as another character, right? It's just, how am I supposed to actually know what's going on here unless Akaksaka has been hinting and writing this in all of the volumes for 5 years at this point, and how we were all supposed to know, like, golly gee, what am I supposed to do, right? Don't sue me, please. But I do like the illustration of this where I is walking into the dark side and Ruby is walking into the light side. It is a very nice visual, and sort of them letting go of each other's hands as they're walking by and staring each other in the face is just a very nice visual. And I do look like Ruby's look here. She's just like doing the slightest smile. It is just very nice and cool to see, right? But to hop into the actual chapter itself, first off, let's just go over what happened last time. Last time we had a very eclectic chapter with a bunch of various things going on, a few scenes being filmed in the movie, some wrapping up of most of the general production, and at the very end of the chapter, we saw that Ruby was out praying at a shrine, and as she was praying there, rain was starting to come down, and somebody walked up behind her with an umbrella to give her some shade from this storm or whatever. And of course, we saw this person was Hikaru, and we had the visual reaction of almost every Oshinoko fan of going, oh, because this was a very, 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 very big deal, right? But actually start off the chapter proper here. We see again the Torii Gate, this shrine, and we see just how much the rain is pouring around and everything, right? As we see just like the rain, just like the like all the sound effects going on, like obviously saying that it is raining hard right now. And then we just see Ruby and then this other person who's holding an umbrella up for Ruby, right? And of course we know this is Hikaru, like how could it not be? And Ruby is just like, oh my gosh, thank you, like sir, you are being such a big help here, right? And Hikaru, of course, who Ruby doesn't recognize, just says like, hey, don't sweat it, I would just happen to have an umbrella with me, so I was lucky, right? And he even says like, hey, You seem to be praying for a long time there. What exactly were you wishing for? And we sort of see that Ruby has a little bit of a blank stare going on as she looks off in the distance or at Hikaru here. And she doesn't quite know what to say, but she eventually speaks up after, like, pausing for a minute. And she says an answer. And she's like, and then she goes into more detail about, like, there is someone that I have hated all this time, but no one was purely born evil in this world. As she says, environment and circumstances destroy people. I might have walked down the same path too. So what went wrong? Maybe it was just bad luck. No one is at fault, I realize that. I too can be saved if I think that way. But then she says, nevertheless, there is someone I can never forgive. Even after a decade, the feeling of not being able to forgive without reason is still there. I feel like I can finally move forward by pouring out all of my hatred, to forgive or to not forgive. I have to choose one, but I don't know what's right. So I want God to tell me what to do. And Ruby sort of just goes through this entire speech here of just anger and vitriol, just like all of this boiled down into her words. And she says that she eventually just like sort of shakes herself back awake as she realized everything that she was just saying. But pretty much to go through that real quick. Yes, so Ruby's looking for an answer. It is obviously the person she's talking about, the person who she's hated this entire time, has to be Hikaru, the person who indirectly murdered her mother, because, while Hikaru didn't actually stab Ai, that was that weird, stalker otaku dude, but, yeah. Hikaru was, like, the indirect reasoning for this, the person who ended up stabbing Ai to begin with, or who gave the address to have Ai stabbed to begin with. So obviously she's talking about Hikaru here, right? But eventually she says, nevertheless, there's someone I can never forget. And at this point, it seems like she may be talking about herself, because as we see this image, we see her, but instead of the light Sharingans, we see the dark Sharingans within her eyes. And as this is all just going through here, we see that she is just like getting more into herself, and we just keep getting constant shots of her eyes and the dark Sharingans within them, until eventually she shakes herself awake, and she has the light Sharingans back in her eyes at the end of the speech, right? And I do find it interesting where she says, so I want God to tell me what to do, because of course we know that there's a physical God in this world who has been helping out our main cast plenty enough through the actions of all of these various volumes, being the Crow Girl Atamarasu, or Tsukuyomi. Tsukuyomi. It's not Atamarasu. Tsukuyomi, right? So we know there's an actual god here, which is a little bit interesting and a little bit funny. Like, okay, that's weird, but sure, I'll take your word for it. And of course, after Ruby goes through this whole thing of like, oh, hey, I hate myself, I hate other people, yada, 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 she eventually, like, just, like, looks over to Car and just says, like, hey, I'm sorry, sir, and she's just like, hey, I just keep saying things that you don't even understand, and she's like, I really haven't gathered all my thoughts here yet, so, like, hey, my bad, I'm sorry, but eventually Hikaru just looks over to her and just says, like, hey, it's okay, you can worry about it to your heart's content, as he says, but strictly speaking, God doesn't give us answers, only you can answer that question. If you come up with an answer after worrying about it so much, then you have to accept it. Everyone does. And at this point hearing this, Ruby pauses for a second, right? And I'm going to pause for a second too, because that is the most Hikaru line I think I may have ever heard in my life. And I want to start off there, right? He says, it's okay, you can worry about it to your heart's content. He's not saying, like, hey, you tell it to me, I'll be a listening ear for you, like a stranger may do, right? He's saying, like, hey, that is your problem to internalize and figure out on your own, which is a very interesting outlook. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody in an anime or manga say that before. I mean, that's just a very interesting concept to try to get across here. I mean, just, like, strictly speaking, like, holy crap, like, that's so interesting of what Hikaru says here. But then the other part of, hey, God doesn't give us answers. Only you can answer that question. Whenever you worry about something so much and you find an answer to it, you have to accept it. Everyone does. I wonder how much trauma is wrapped up in Hikaru's words here. Because, of course, just thinking through the few scenes that we have seen filmed for this movie, Hikaru is a very problematic character. Stemming from that problematic character nature that Hikaru has, we have seen him going through these things of where something happened to where he has to just accept an answer after fretting over something so much. And he just has to come to terms with it because, I mean, that is the only thing he can reasonably do. Which is just so very interesting for looking at Hikaru's character as a whole, right? Ruby just, like, finally speaks up after that initial pause. And she's just like, oh, so you think... But Hikaru just cuts her off, just saying, like, hey, yeah. It's not something you want to ask God anyway. And Hikaru says, he'd rather listen to your true wish, I guess. And the weird thing here is that whenever Hikaru says true wish, it is bolded, right? Of course, there are some words that are just naturally bolded in manga, and it's just very interesting to see what he's talking about here, as he's like, listen to your true wish, I guess. And Ruby's just like, true wish? Like very, like, questioning, like, what is this guy talking about? But eventually Hikaru says, hey, what do you want to do? What do you want to become? I want to hear it too. And eventually, Ruby speaks up. We see that the rain is actually starting to fade at this moment, as it's starting to become slowly sunnier out, as eventually Ruby just says, oh, well, I want to fulfill my mother's unfinished dreams. And Hikaru's like, oh, so you want to be like your mother? And he just says, like, hey, you want to be even one step closer to her. But then Ruby continues, simply saying, and I'll become an idol that surpasses my mom. She says, people will idolize me more and more, to the point where they can't afford to think about the past. I think that's the only way we can all be saved. And in this moment, we get a shot of Hikaru's face full on here, as he's sort of looking back at Ruby, and just a familial resemblance between Aqua and Hikaru is just absolutely hilarious, because these two characters look exactly like each other, especially when they have the dark Sharingans in their eyes, which, I mean, they always do. They have such an uncanny resemblance. I mean, yes, they're father and son, but it is just so funny to look at and fully see. But yeah, looking at that, Ruby eventually turns around to fully look at Hikaru, and she has both of the light Sharingans in her eyes. It is just a beautiful looking panel here on page, page 12 if I'm not mistaken. But Hikaru's just like, oh, that's wonderful. As he says, hey, there is no one brighter than you in this world right now. Your life is precious. And he eventually starts to walk towards her, reaches out a hand towards Ruby, and says, perhaps even more than your ma. And before he can fully finish out the word mother, we hear a voiceover from the other side of this area that they're walking in, down the steps of the shrine. And we just hear somebody yell, Ruby-chan, right? As we see this is none other than Akane, who suddenly appears behind the two of them, right? And we see that Akane's here, and she's like, oh, hey, Ruby, did you go to visit your mother's grave? And, Ruby's like, oh, hey, Akane, I mean, what are you doing here, right? And, Ruby's like, oh, who is this gentleman, right? And Ruby's just like, oh, hey, it's starting to rain up there, so he shared his umbrella with me, and she's like, I don't even know who, he really is. He's just some random person, right? But eventually Ruby just goes over to where Hikaru is, bows down, gives him like a formal bow, and just says like, oh, thank you very much, I will take all of this from here. As eventually, Hikaru just sort of looks over at the two of them, and he looks to Akane and just like, oh, sure, please do, take it from here, right? As we see that Akane starts to walk away with Ruby, and Akane's just like, oh, hey, let's go out and get some tea, right? And Ruby's like, alright, that sounds good to me. As we eventually see that Akane looks back and gives the big stink eye to Hikaru, like really like looking at him like, oh hey, like big fuck you, right? Like just showing him like, hey, I don't like you very much. As we see that Hikaru's here, and we also see this other woman that I think we know who this person is, but I feel really bad that I do not fully remember what her name is. Let me go to the Oshinoko wiki and see if she is on here, because I think that she was I don't really remember. I'm pretty sure I've talked about her before, but I genuinely don't remember. I feel really, really bad about this. Granted, it's just stupid character, so it doesn't really matter that much. Yeah. Yeah, this is just, the person that Hikaru's talked with before. She will just be, Hikaru's entourage. I don't know. I honestly forget her name. But, this person, is just like, hey, has she been following you lately, Kamaki-san? She doesn't actually call him Hikaru, she calls him Kamaki, which, I mean, makes sense. But Hikaru's just like, oh, maybe. As she says, like, hey, good gracious, I think it's time for me to pay the piper. As Hikaru just continues saying, like, hey, this movie reveals everything about Ari-san and Seijiro-san without reserve. As he says, it'll become a hot topic in both a good and very, very bad way. As he says, and yet, I am referred to as Boy A here in this movie. As he says, Kaburagi-san is sure ill-natured, huh? As eventually, Hikaru's just like, hey, once this movie is released, they'll definitely start hunting for the culprit. They'll ask, who is Boy A? And on all of the various tabloids and on social media. As he's essentially like, hey, I guess he's trying to kill me, not by the movie's topic, but by the public's malice. As the woman's just like, hey, I'm Hikaru, right? But Hikaru just speaks up and just like, hey, it is alright. As he says, hey, I knew this day would come sooner than later. As he says, hey, I don't mind rotting like this either. As he just sort of continues saying like, hey, or if my manga decks would load, right? I guess I've got to manually click through the chapter now. But Hikaru just says like, hey, along with all the many lies I've carried upon my back. But he says, but before all of that, and we don't get the closing remarks to his statements, as we eventually get the final idea of the rest of the movie is now being filmed. As we see that, we see a bunch of various scenes. We see that, Ruby in the whole I Get Up being pregnant and going to see the doctor. We see Melt as, Goro, dead on the ground after, the stalker has pushed him off and murdered Goro. We see the first New Age Biko no Hachi performance, which is actually this is the old Biko no Hachi performance whenever I gets back or something. I'm not 100% sure, but we see, scene of also Hikaru here with the leader of the Lai troop, and we see that, Hikaru comes over and gives a few flowers to Ruby, and there's not really anything else to that. And then we eventually see the scene where, the random stalker guy is coming in and has ended up killing, of course, our favorite Ai. And we see the little head of Hikaru and Tsukuyomi on the ground there, because of course that is the famous scene where, yes, a death happens, right? And we eventually see the blood on the ground and the look of Ruby dying on the ground, or not Ruby dying, but Ai dying on the ground. And we see just tears welling up in Ruby's eyes as all this happens, showing that, yes, she is also able to cry like her mother did on her deathbed. Woohoo! And we eventually just get some of the producers going like, alright, Ruby-san, that's a wrap! And that's really all there is to it. As we get the final chapter of the series finally announced, which is the following chapter, the end of the play. Which, I don't know if that's referring to, like, the end of the plays and, like, hey, here's the end of the movie, or the end of Oshinoko to go with, right? Because a lot of loose ties have been sort of wrapping up here, so what's really gonna happen, right? It's very interesting to see. But yeah, that is this chapter of Oshinoko. Definitely a very, very interesting one for sure. I gotta click through all of the pages now. I can't simply just scroll through them, which does make it more than a little annoying, but it is what it is. Very, 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 very interesting chapter. A bunch of big, like, concepts are dropped in this chapter. I honestly think one of my favorite things that is said is Hikaru's line that I dissected earlier about the whole thing of, like, hey, you can worry about it to your heart's content, and he's just like, hey, God doesn't give us answers and all of that. It's like, hey, you got to find the answer to yourself, and when you've come to the answer, you have to just roll with it. Sort of just showing all of the Hikaru's trauma that he's gone through during his entire time being an actor and his entire time really living because of all of the shitty stuff that he had done to him. Like, just a very serious topic and just a bunch of really, really serious stuff going on here. And then all of the whole stuff of Akane coming in to grab Ruby, which Akane's best girl. Akane's a girl who saves Ruby from death, because I don't want to know what Hikaru would have done to Ruby, but it would have not been anything good whatsoever. So just very good. And then Hikaru's final scene of just like, hey, I don't mind rotting like this either, along with the many lives I've carried on my back. Just, oh, Hikaru is MVP for this chapter, for sure, because even though Ruby doesn't understand who he is, he comes in, gives a presence, meets one of our main cast for really the first time. I say main cast because, I'm sorry, I don't think producer Kaburagi really counts too much. I mean, I hate to say it, but I really don't think he does. So, just a big, big moment, and one that, yeah. Hikaru showed what he's made of in, like, our current representation of him, and showed that he's a big deal. Great chapter, Hikaru MVP. I think that's what this episode may be called, Hikaru for Oshiko no Ko MVP. I don't know, I've yet to figure all that out yet, but yeah. Thank you guys so very much for watching, and yeah. I really don't have too much else to say about this. I don't know where to end this. I'm just rambling at this point. So yeah, this has been Oshi no Ko, chapter number 147, titled Wish. And yeah, this will be Will Plasma 231, signing out.